would like to hear your comments on the sudden awakening experience of the famous spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle, as recounted by himself. Can you share your comments on what happened to him and why? This is what he wrote in the book, The Power of Now. He wrote, "Until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety, interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. It feels now as if I'm talking about some past life or somebody else's life. One night, I woke up in the early hours with a feeling of absolute dread. I had woken up with such a feeling many times before, but this time it was more intense than it had ever been. Everything felt so alien, so hostile, and so utterly meaningless that it created in me a deep loathing of the world. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why carry on with this continuous struggle? I could feel that a deep longing for annihilation, for non-existence, was now becoming much stronger than the instinctive desire to continue to live. I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. Then suddenly I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this strange realization that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first, and then accelerated. I was gripped by an intense fear, and my body started to shake. I heard the words "resist nothing," as if spoken inside my chest. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. It felt as if the void was inside myself rather than outside. Suddenly, there was no more fear, and I let myself fall into that void. I have no recollection of what happened after that. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I had never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could make a sound, this is what it would be like. I opened my eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Without any thought, I knew that there's infinitely more to life than we realize. That soft luminosity filtering through the curtains was love itself. Tears came into my eyes. I got up and walked around the room. I recognized the room, and yet I knew that I had never truly seen it before. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it had just come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into this world. For the next 5 months, I lived in a state of uninterrupted, deep peace and bliss. After that, it diminished somewhat in intensity, or perhaps it just seemed to, because it became my natural state. I could still function in the world, although I realized that nothing I ever did could possibly add anything to what I already had. I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, but I didn't understand it at all. It wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. This withdrawal must have been so complete that this false, suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. What was left then was my true nature as the ever-present I am, consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. Later, I also learned to go into that inner, timeless, and deathless realm that I had originally perceived as a void, and remain fully conscious. I dwelt in states of such undescribable bliss and sacredness that even the original experience I just described pales in comparison. A time came when for a while I was left with nothing on the physical plane. I had no relationships, no job, no home, no socially defined identity. I spent almost 2 years sitting on park benches in a state of the most intense joy. Even the most beautiful experiences come and go, though. More fundamental, perhaps, than any experience is the undercurrent of peace that has never left me since then. Sometimes it is very strong, almost palpable, and others can feel it too. At other times, it is somewhere in the background, like a distant melody. Later, people would occasionally come up to me and say, "I want what you have. Can you give it to me or show me how to get it?" And I would say, "You have it already. You just can't feel it because your mind is making too much noise." That answer later grew into the book that you are holding in your hands. Before I knew it, I had an external identity again. I had become a spiritual teacher. So that's the sudden awakening story of Eckhart Tolle. Could you share your comments on what happened to Eckhart Tolle and why?
Yes, I can. That experience that he had is not that uncommon. Well, many people awake in this manner, but for every one that does, there's probably 100 or so who just commit suicide and end it all. So it's not it's not a good path to take. Statistically, it would not be well, let me try to get really, really miserable first. It doesn't. That is not a good path to take. But people who are miserable, and often they are people who are sensitive, who are aware of the dysfunctionality around them. They're aware of their own dysfunctionality. They are generally insecure in that they don't have a strong sense of their own identity. They don't have a strong sense of self-esteem. And the person and thing that they detest and dislike the most is themselves. They aren't succeeding. They don't have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They don't have a good job. They just are failing in life. They don't have good relationships. They're lonely, and just everything in their life is failing. And when that happens, what people tend to do, because they're fearful to begin with, is they start to have self-pity. Woe is me. My life is terrible. It can't get any worse. And then, of course, it always does right after you say that. So these are the kinds of people that are kind of primed for this experience. Like I say, the largest number of them commit suicide because they feel that bad. But every so often, you get one who typically is right-brained, lives more on the intuitive side and not on the intellectual side, that finds a trigger right at that moment that they're on the very bottom, and it's called the dark night of the soul. That's a name that's been given to this phenomena. And they're having this dark night of the soul, but they have something that triggers them to see the world differently. And for him, it was that there was a double. Well, there must be an I that could look independently at the miserable me. That was the trigger. And once he got that trigger, then he could realize that he wasn't just that miserable person. That was a creation of his own mind. That was his creation. He didn't have to be that. He could be something else. So I don't know. I guess I've read lots of such stories, the dark night of the soul stories. But the person, if they are very intellectual or very left brain, it's unlikely that they'll get that trigger right at that moment where they're at the bottom, contemplating suicide, that will then suddenly allow them to see it from a different direction. If he hadn't of kind of amused himself with the idea that there must be two of him, the one who was miserable and the one who was watching him be miserable. If he hadn't picked up on that, then he probably would have been a suicide. So that was the trigger. And if you read these stories, you'll see that all the ones that come out the other end better, there's something that triggers them right at that moment where they're most desperate. The ones that go ahead and commit suicide, nothing triggers them. But that latter group is by far the larger group. And that latter group contains most of the intellectuals and people who are left brain logical types. Because this trigger is not one of logic, really. It's a trigger of understanding that I'm consciousness. I don't have to be like this. That miserable person is really not me. There's more to me than this. And partly, I think what helps produce that trigger is when they get to the point where they start contemplating suicide, ending it all. Because then you start to think about, well, who am I? What's going to be lost? What's going to be gained? I'll be terminated. I won't have any more of this misery. But you begin to also see, yeah, but there's something else that was going on there in this life. It wasn't just miserable me. There's a person inside that has potential. And if that little flick happens, then you come back up the other side. If it doesn't happen, you go on and commit suicide. So not a path to take on purpose. But for those people who are very depressed, it sometimes bounces back up into something that's very good. So it can be a beginning of some much better path. Because once they see that possibility, what that trigger is just a possibility. It's not a way out just yet. It's just a possibility that miserable person isn't really all of me. There's more of me than that. So there's a possibility suddenly that grows. And then they grab hold of that possibility, and I don't want to be that miserable person. I want to identify with this other. And when they do that, then they see that all the misery's gone. That other part of them is just their IUOC, you might say. That part of them that is their potential to be. The miserable person is what they've made of that potential up to that point. But they realize that potential can be developed at any time. All right, I've made a mess of developing my potential so far, but it's just potential. I can develop it differently. And then they give up. That old way is just gone. It's like that's stripped away. And then they go into this ecstasy experience where they see the beauty of everything. And that's partly the reason they do that is it's in direct contrast to the misery of everything. So they see the beauty of everything to about the same degree as they saw the terribleness of everything. It's almost like an equal switch. So as much as they thought everything was awful, that's how much they see that everything is wonderful. And instead of seeing all the dysfunction that we create, they see all the possibilities that we have to be otherwise. So that's really what was going on. Happens to probably, I don't know, a third of the people who end up being spiritual teachers. There's not that many spiritual teachers around. It's not like, the one in every 20 people or something. It's probably one in every, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. I don't know, but it's not a very large number. But a fair number of them do bounce back up. Now, they all don't become Eckhart Tolles. Eckhart Tolle became the way he was because of the situation he was in. Typically, they come back up, realize that their potential can be developed in other ways. It doesn't have to be developed toward the dark side. It can be developed toward the light side. They're just potential. Which was that potential was the other eye that he saw there. But typically, they have husbands or wives, they have children, they may have a job that they're just kind of going through the motions, but at least it's a job. They have some connections to life. And when they do, then they generally don't end up being a spiritual teacher. They end up getting it all back together, starting to like themselves better since they reject that person that they were. They start developing their potential, and they may write a book, they may do this and that, but they don't really become an Eckhart Tolle. He's not just a spiritual teacher, but he's well known by probably hundreds of millions of people. He's exceptional in that way. Well, he was exceptional in that way because what did he said that for months he was just in a state of bliss. Well, that was just him not being miserable. He was in a state of misery before, and now he was experiencing not being miserable. So he was in that state of bliss. Everything was wonderful. Everything was happy. Everything was possible. And he was just basking in that wonderfulness that he found. He could see his potential. He could be anything. He could be much more. He saw the possibilities. So that's what he did for months and months, was just to, it's kind of like, re-energizing yourself. So he had to experience almost as much positive bliss and positive things to counterweight and finally cut away all the negative stuff. So that took months. And that's all he did for months, was just to experience that positive. And that allowed him to just drop the negative, because it wasn't just a momentary thing and he was going to go back to being depressed the next week. He owned it now, and it took him months to convince himself of that he owned this positive space that he was in. And then he said that it wasn't until several years later that let's see, what did he say? Several years. Well, he said he spent time on the park bench, right? And he didn't have a job. He didn't have a family. He didn't have anything else. So that's what allowed him then just to concentrate on his spiritual being. So he did that for years. So it wasn't sudden. A lot of people think that, oh, the dark night of the soul, you go down to the bottom and suddenly you're a master. You awake and everything is clear and perfect. But it doesn't work like that. You go down and you hit the bottom, but you see another possibility. You see potential that you didn't realize you had. But then it takes time to growth, to take all that, to finally let go of the negativity, to understand the positive side of things, to realize how just by changing your perspective, the whole world changes. So you were creating that miserable world, and now everything has beauty in it. Everything has positiveness in it. So it takes a while to digest and really take all that in and be able to own that, so it's yours. And it's not just a great dream you're having, but it's really yours. So that took time. And the fact that he was on a park bench with nothing else to do meant that's what he spent all his time doing, rather than finally having more fun with his children, repairing his relationship with his wife, waking up on the job and being more productive and pulling his life together. He could have gone that path, and then he probably wouldn't have been a spiritual teacher, but he would have been a more spiritual person. And in that way, he'd have still been a teacher, but not like he became. He would have been kind of an unknown teacher, a teacher that taught by example, and a teacher that was probably would volunteer, down at the Alcoholics Anonymous place or other place where you have depressed, unhappy people, so that he could help them. That sort of a thing. So he'd be that sort of a teacher, but not the teacher that Eckhart became. So it doesn't just suddenly translate them into a wise and knowledgeable person. It sets them on a path that takes them that way. And if they have enough time and are not connected with other things they have to do, like children and wives and jobs, then they end up more like Eckhart Tolle, or those who make spirituality their life. The teaching and understanding and so on they write books. First book is the turnaround book. what happened to me. And then after that, they realized that a lot of other people are also miserable and they can write more books and helps more people and so on. So that's Eckhart Tolle. But if you went through the fairly well-known spiritual teachers, you'd probably find a significant minority of them have a similar story, because it's not that many people who just decide that they'll just put more time into the spiritual side of life just because that's what they feel like doing. That doesn't occur that often. There has to be something that bumps you into that direction if you take it more seriously than just a personal thing. If you take it to a point where you become nationally known or internationally known, then that's exceptional. So I think that's what's going on. Very typical story. Very typical story. The guy who, what is it, Conversations with God. He wrote that book. It was the same thing. He was down, he was out, he was a bum living in the park, someplace. He was homeless and he was desperate and his life wasn't worth living. And the same thing. He got a little spark. He got a trigger that helped him get out of it. He started asking himself questions and he got answers. Well, the reason he got answers is because he was a more intuitive person to begin with. That's why I say it's the people who are intuitive and more right brain are more likely to have this process happen to them. The intellects would say, "Oh yeah, very clever. I can't live with me." That's just a trick of the language. I could have said I can't live with I, but that would have been poor grammar. Or me can't live with me, but that just would have been poor grammar. It doesn't mean anything. It's just nonsense. I'm miserable, and they would have had that kind of that's the intellectual attitude toward it. It was just a quirk of language. There wasn't a great piece of symbolism there to distinguish the spiritual from the mundane. It was just a quirk of the language that he happened to use, because you start a sentence with I, and then if you're going to refer to yourself, you don't say I again. Now you're talking about yourself, so now it has to be something else. It's the way the language is constructed. So anyhow, it doesn't matter where the trigger comes from, but an intellectual would not have been able to hang on to that trigger because they would have disowned it as being meaningful. A right brain person sees it, gets kind of the symbolic meaning, not the logical meaning, but the symbolic meaning of that. And then he interpreted it in a way that saved him. So that's why the right brainers tend to do this. And of course, the right brainers tend to be more the teachers, right? They're more the holistic, big picture thinkers that tend to become spiritual teachers. Now, I'm a very unusual spiritual teacher in that sense that I'm a physicist. I'm a hardcore left brain type logical process guy, but I'm also really well developed right, hemisphere as well. But that's a very unusual combination. So that's sort of what was going on there. He was the right kind of person, hit the right kind of trigger at just the right time, and bingo. But as a spiritual path, I think you were kind of looking at this and saying, well, is that a pathway? Is there a way that you can go here and suddenly go up the other side? And no, it's not a pathway at all, particularly for an intellectual like you. It would not be a good pathway. The probability of you getting a trigger that your intellect wouldn't throw out as nonsense, is very, very rare. Probably wouldn't happen. So I don't suggest that you take that as a path toward enlightenment. It is a really hard path, because the people that do it are really desperate. They are suicidal. They are really failed in every way that they can think of, and they feel like they are worthless. And that's a horrible feeling to have.